You're listening to the When Life Hands You Lemons podcast.
But in an entry-level film production, it's one strike and you're out. You're fired. I'm not calling you back.
If your goal today is to make a basket, we're going to make that basket.
The minute you create something, as soon as it's made tangible, you have a copyright in it.
How do I get our guys to sound that big, that full when they do the harmonies?
And I'm your host, Lennon Seahawk. Let's get to the show.
So I am Alexandria Perryman. I'm currently the lead audio engineer at NASA at Johnson Space Center here in Houston, Texas. I work also as the producer and chief engineer for NASA's Houston We Have a Podcast as well. I got into the audio world actually through band. I was in marching band in high school, and I got injured my senior year, ended up having to use crutches, so I couldn't march. And I was able to take over as the front ensemble sound mixer, hooking up the microphones to all the marimbas and things like that. And that's where I got the first buzz for actually the production side, not so much the performance side of music, but the production side of music. And that's what led me to wanting to find a degree or something in that field. I wasn't quite sure exactly what I wanted to do. I wasn't sure if I wanted to do live or be in the studio, but I knew just working on consoles and being creative that way was a better feeling for me than playing an instrument. And that's what kind of got me into being involved in music and live audio. And so when I was looking for colleges, I actually first reached out to Berklee College of Music. And I wasn't too thrilled on the fact that I had to audition playing my instrument, which I played the saxophone. But I went to Boston and auditioned for it, and I got in, but I didn't love it. I didn't love being in Boston. I'm from Texas. It was a little too cold for me. I went in January, so I was a bit out of my element. But as I was looking up schools online, I found Full Sail, and I was like, oh, this is exactly what I wanted. I don't have to play an instrument. And while I was a student at Full Sail, that's when I really began to get into more of not just, oh, this is something cool, but this is exactly what I want to do, and I'm pretty good at it. And that's what kind of led me. And after I graduated from Full Sail, I ended up working at a music studio for about a month, and I realized that the studio wasn't really what I wanted to do all the time. Like I loved working in the studio, but I didn't want to do it every single day. And so I started looking for more things that was kind of live. And when I found NASA, it was perfect because I can record in a studio. Now I'm not recording music, but I'm recording in a studio environment. I'm doing live. I'm going on field shoots. So I'm doing pretty much anything you can do with audio. I get to do it, so I never get bored. And that's where I'm at today.
That's pretty cool. And it's funny how, you go to a school, you learn, or you learn all this audio stuff and music stuff, and you think like, oh, I'm going to do game audio, or I'm going to go work for this company. I'm going to work in a studio. I'm going to work for these labels. And you took a completely different route. You're working for a space agency,
Yeah.
and that's so weird. So what does a lead audio person at NASA do? Like, I know you briefly touched on it, like you get to do everything audio, but can you talk a little bit more about what that means, especially at NASA?
So what that means is, with NASA, you can't just be really good at one thing. You need to be kind of versatile. So I couldn't just be pretty good at recording people in the studio with, like a microphone, or recording just straight for the podcast. I needed to be able to go from recording a video shoot inside of a Mars rover to doing a live show of a spacewalk or a launch or a landing. And I'm the one that's sitting there in the audio control room is what we call it. And I'm pushing up the audio coming down from space and the audio from the ground that's going up to space. I'm mixing all that out on NASA TV Live. So I'm having to bounce in between working in a studio environment and doing voiceovers or recording our podcast to going to live. And I literally have done all of those things in one day, and when it's a busy day.
I mean, so you never know what you're going to get in
Exactly.
every day.
Yeah.
And I'm sure like space launches, they get postponed for various reasons all the time. So you can never really expect anything, correct?
That is correct. I mean, I've had it where, I was working a SpaceX launch. We came in there, we started our news show, and we were live on air, and then we found out it was going to get delayed because of weather. And so I was in at 2:00 in the morning and had to turn right back around and go home.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it sounds so crazy because I don't think I'll ever ask this question in my life ever again. But what is it like to mix the sound for a rocket ship?
It is the coolest thing ever because the way they have to go out and capture that sound. Right now, we're launching our astronauts in Russia, in Kazakhstan. And so the way they have the microphones are so far back, and they maybe have like 5 or 6 microphones out there capturing, and they're sending it to us through like this video encoder, really, really high tech encoder that's coming to us. And I basically get the 2-channel mix that they give me, and I have to kind of somehow mix that in and not overpower the commentator that's talking, and making sure I don't overpower the interpreter that's talking when the Russian cosmonauts are talking to each other. So it's actually kind of like a dance, trying to figure it out how I can blend this in to where the people at home can still get that feeling as if they're there watching the rocket launch live, but at the same time understand that this is a show. So it's an interesting little dance you have to do when you're trying to mix that in, but it's amazing hearing it in the speakers in the studio.
I mean, I can imagine. So what does some of the technology look like when you're recording some of these microphones or some of these like rocket launches? Because rockets are incredibly, incredibly loud and powerful. So like what types of equipment does it take to ensure that all that noise and those high decibel and sound pressure levels are captured in high quality, and then you're able to correctly perceive them in meters or in the speakers? And how does all of that kind of work? Because it's completely different from mixing vocals and audio and music and instruments.
Yeah, it is different. So the way that they do is that they have a team, like we have a team of people here at NASA that goes over to Russia, and they set up all of that. So they have the audio and video coming in live to us through a digital encoder. Basically, that's what television stations use whenever they're trying to bounce in between satellites. And so they bounce it from there to a satellite that comes to us, and we receive it through this personal encoder that we have with Russia. And sometimes it is, the video quality is never the best, but the audio has always been really good coming in, especially for rocket launches. The audio has been great. And I think it's because they figured it out now. They've had a lot of trial and errors. I'm pretty sure there's been a lot of microphones that have blown out in the past. But I know they use different types of shotgun microphones, and they're back like hundreds of feet away from the rocket launch. One, because of safety reasons, but two, because the microphone being too close to it would damage the diaphragm of the microphone. So they're back pretty far, but that just lets you know how good some of these microphones are, to where it can still capture it in such high quality and stream it live at the same time.
Right. That's so impressive to me, and I'm sure the listeners will agree, because not many people get to mix rocket ships on a day-to-day basis.
Right, yeah.
And not many people get to understand, like, you really get to push some of these microphones and some of these equipment to some of their limits, I'm sure, because how many companies build microphones specifically for, like, oh, we're going to use this to record rocket ships. Like, that's not really the common thing. Like I said, it's such a unique thing to get into and do, that it's so mind-blowing to me, even, because I think it's such a cool job.
Oh yeah, it is kind of, when I first saw it, and I was like, man, this rocket launch is live. Like, this is live, and I'm mixing this live out on air. And then, of course, TV has maybe like a 20-30 second delay, so I'm getting it before everyone else is. And sometimes, I remember my first couple of times I had to kind of make sure I focus on mixing, because I was just in awe of what I was watching.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine, like, a rocket launch is something so spectacular, and it's so cool to see, but you got to remember to kind of stay focused. So how did you kind of teach yourself that I'm at work, I'm being paid to mix, not watch the show? How did you kind of teach yourself to do that and get past the awe moment?
Well, one thing that helps is the fact that I am constantly having to listen to the different voice loops that are not going out on air. So I'm listening to our flight director and the flight team, and I'm listening to the commentator, and I'm talking with the producer constantly about the shows and what if we're going to have a video package rolling, when we're going to do it, and count down into that. And so that helps me kind of draw me back in, like, hey, okay, don't watch that. You need to focus on your mix. And then also just repetition. I mean, every rocket launch is different, but after a while, I mean, I've seen a lot of rocket launches coming in. And so when you're sitting in there, that I'll still take time and watch, but it's usually whenever the countdown is at like 10. And then I'll start really focusing into the launch, because our commentator stops talking. Everyone gets kind of quiet until the thing actually lifts off. And so that gives me at least a little 10 seconds so I can kind of watch and be just a fan of watching the launch instead of having to worry about mixing.
So what's it like when you're sitting there, and what's kind of going through your mind during those 10 seconds? Like, you have 10 seconds before everything's live, but like you are basically in the seat of somebody that like nobody else has such a unique job. And like, what is kind of running through your head going like, wow, I'm really mixing audio for rocket launches for NASA?
Well, every single time it's kind of one of those heart, stopping moments watching it. Because I get to know these astronauts before they go to Russia. We do a lot of news conferences and different video shoots, and I bring them on the podcast that we have, and I get to know them personally. So it's kind of like, oh man, like I know this guy that's launching. Please be safe. Please let everything go okay. It's those kind of feelings. Once at first it was like, oh, it's a rocket launch. It's amazing. But now it's kind of like, that's my friend, that I've grown close with over the past couple of months. Please be okay. And you're just thinking about the safety, and you're excited for them, because a lot of them, this is their first time launching. So that excitedness, as if, that's somebody I actually know that's going up there. So after a while, it starts turning into more emotion of my friend is launching on a rocket right now.
And, we've heard horror stories of all these horrible rocket launches and ones that have went awry. And technology has gotten so far advanced that we've basically minimized and are able to detect so many things before it even happens, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, it's especially because, back in October, there was a launch abort that they actually have to do. And I was the one that was mixing that launch show. And, I'm seeing enough launch shows to know that something wasn't right with the rocket. So I've seen enough to know, like, hey, this doesn't look right. And then I'm listening to the astronauts on board, and I'm hearing the alarms in the background. I'm like, hey, something's not right. Are we going to cut? What's going on? And so we kind of like cut off the screen from it until we figured out what exactly was going on. And then that's when we found out they actually had to abort. So they reached space, out of Earth's atmosphere a little bit, and they reached space, and then they actually had to launch off of that rocket to get away from it before it exploded, which means that everything worked. The launch abort worked, and that's amazing that it did, because their lives would have been lost. But just having to sit there and watch that, and this is a show that I'm mixing, it's kind of like one of my worst nightmares coming true.
Yeah, and you talk about having to remain focused because you're doing your job and mixing everything. Talk about really forcing yourself to stay focused. That was probably a difficult situation there.
Oh yeah, it definitely was.
You talked about like having to, many of the missions have been kind of canceled, and you were coming in at 2 a.m. and you just have to turn around and go back home. How do you kind of manage those stressful times? Like, I'm sure it's kind of upsetting and stressful that, when you come in to mix a show and it's 3 a.m. in the morning and you just got 2-3 hours of sleep, and then find out you get to work and find out that you have to turn around and go back home, and who knows when they're gonna start again.
Exactly.
How do those situations kind of come about? Like, how do you handle those situations? Because I'm sure it's kind of a big letdown. Like, oh, I got ready for work, and then now you gotta.
You know what? It is a letdown, and there's sometimes where I hadn't had any sleep the night before, and so I'm already exhausted, and I get here, I set everything up, and it doesn't happen. So it is a bit of a downer, but I know from just working there and being around there, they wouldn't cancel a launch if it wasn't important. They wouldn't cancel this if it wasn't for safety reasons. And so, they just won't cancel it just to cancel it. they have a lot of people who are doing the same exact thing that I'm doing. It's not just about me. You know, the astronauts are bombed because if it's a cargo mission, that's their clothes and their food that they're going to have to wait more days on to get there. And so I have to think about that. It's not just me that's having to deal with this. It's everyone, and it's a tough decision. And, you know, it's usually almost 100% of the time all about safety reasons, and safety comes first. And so I was like, okay, I lost sleep, but no one lost their life. So there's that.
That's a very good point. You know, you lost sleep, but nobody lost their lives, and they're going to be able to come home to their families and all that stuff. So that's definitely a good mindset to have. And I mean, I'm sure it's upsetting, like you had said. You know, you come into work and turns out, oh, sorry, the mission got canceled. You got to turn around and go back home and come back to work in 3-4 hours, but like you said, you know, you lost sleep, but nobody lost their lives. I really like that quote.
That's the main important thing, is safety. That's what I noticed about NASA is that their safety is everything there. I mean, we have so many safety things that we have just in our office building, just making sure like, hey, we get a safety alert every single day, just about little tidbit things like, hey, if you're riding your bike to work, make sure you're wearing your helmet. It's just that safety is the number one important thing. So when I finally got that instilled into me after being a newbie, I'm now turned into that person to where I'm like, it's okay if the lunch didn't happen. Everybody's okay. That's fine.
Mm-hmm. And that's very good that they prioritize that. I think a lot of people should prioritize that. Like just simple reminders like that. Or like, oh, you're in a hurry. Don't forget to wear your helmet to work today, you know?
Yeah.
So it's just little important things like that. And it shows that they care, you know, that we really do care about your safety and well-being. So how long have you been at NASA now?
So I have been at NASA for about 2 years and 9 months. It'll be 3 years in November.
Oh, wow. Congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
3 year. That's pretty amazing. So where do you hope to go from here? Like, do you want to move up in NASA? Like what is your goal?
You know, it's interesting because I had like this huge plan that I wrote out right when I graduated, and I am not going by that plan at all. And so I'm kind of making it up as I reach another goal. So I start making smaller goals. Like when I first started working at NASA, my first goal was, okay, I want to be able to, one, by the end of this year, understand the NASA lingo. And I want to be able to not just be an assistant on the shows, but actually get to run some of my own shows. And so when I reached that goal, I was like, okay, well, now I want to present a project to NASA and see it going forward. And that's when I came out with the podcast. And then I said that I wanted to be the lead of audio. And so I just learned to start making those shorter goals instead of the really big goal at the end, because of the fact that, you know, life happens, plans change. And those goals right there are easier for me to manage in my head with what's going on without getting too freaked out. Maybe I'm not going on the right path, and just kind of taking it day by day and seeing how if I still love it. And that's the interesting thing about NASA is that, and what people always say is, once you get hired on NASA, if you make it your first year, the chances of you leaving is slim to none. And it makes a lot of sense because a lot of my coworkers have been there for 15 years plus, and they love it. They come there every day. It's a high stressful job, but the reward is bigger than the stress that it gives you. So I don't see myself leaving NASA in the near future. I always joke with them. I was like, the only way I'll leave NASA is if like Oprah or Shonda Rhimes ask me to work on something. That'll be the day I'll leave.
And are you just big fans of Oprah and Shonda Rhimes?
Yeah, it's just one of those things. I mean, NASA was such a big goal for me. Like when I was little, I wanted to be an astronaut like many other kids, and I really was off into science. But when I started getting into audio, I kind of put science on the back burner when I was in band and things like that. When I went to Full Sail and in college, I didn't, think so much about NASA. I never kind of incorporated what I want to do and being able to incorporate that at NASA. And so NASA was kind of one of those far off goals and far off dreams. And since I actually achieved that dream, being able to work at NASA, doing the things that I love to do, I'm like, I wonder if I can do this now. Or I wonder if I can do that. It's like, yeah, I probably could work on a show with Oprah. That would be cool. So it's one of those things. It's like, well, you know what? Maybe I could try tackling that next. Who knows? It might work out.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe Oprah will be one of the listeners into this episode. So shout out to Oprah.
Shout out to Oprah.
We got somebody that wants to help you out in some projects. So shout out. So you talked about, you started all these smaller goals, and then finally it led to kind of a bigger goal, which was starting the Houston We Have a Podcast podcast. So can you talk about like kind of the points leading up to that? What made you finally decide like, I'm going to pitch this to NASA and let's see where it goes? And they loved it, obviously.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about that story?
Yeah, so really how it started is that me and the host of the show, Gary Jordan, both of us kind of have like pretty long commutes. I live about an hour away from NASA. At the time, he lived in the city, and he lived maybe like a 30 to 45-minute drive away. So we kind of big drives. And we were talking about podcasts. We're like, hey, how come NASA doesn't have a podcast? And we just kind of both kept talking about it. And we kept bringing it up. I was like, you know what? We should have a podcast. We should have a NASA podcast. And Gary went back and talked to his supervisors because he's a commentator and he does a lot of the live stuff on NASA. So he has a different set of, I'm a contractor, federal contractor, and he's a civil servant. So he has a different set of bosses and things like that. And I went back and I talked to my bosses about it. And I was like, NASA should have a podcast. They're like, yeah, we don't have one. People just couldn't believe that we didn't have one already. And not just Johnson Space Center, but a lot of the other centers did not have a podcast. And it was interesting how it came about is because Gary came to me and was like, hey, I was talking to the upper heads here and they think it's kind of a cool idea. And in some kind of way, my supervisor, I guess the supervisors were talking to each other. And then my supervisor came to me and was like, hey, they like the idea for the podcast. So here's the deal. You and Gary came up with it, so you two are running the show. So I was recording and Gary was the host. And that's the way it began. And we started out, we didn't have a budget for this because it was just a filler idea to see if this would even work. And it took us a while before we can even get an episode recorded. So we just went ahead and recorded our own pilot episode. We grabbed Dan Hewitt, who's another commentator there, and got him to be on that episode and just talk about what the International Space Station is and just sit there and have a conversation. And then that way we can use that to pitch it to headquarters and get, the blessing of headquarters and the other NASA people that are in charge with communications. And they loved it. They're like, oh, we like this. This is kind of different than what we normally have. If NASA does something, it's usually heavily scripted. If it's live on TV or if we're doing a video shoot, there's a teleprompter. And we don't have like real conversations with astronauts or scientists that are working on something. And this is, our base is just a conversation, just kind of like how me and you are talking right here. That's how we pitched the idea of the podcast. And it was kind of something different. We're like, we're going to try to make these scientists and these astronauts seem human. And they love the idea, and we've been going strong ever since.
I think with podcasts, a lot of people overthink them, and I think it's really a very overthought medium, because like with this podcast, I didn't really have a script. I wrote down a couple notes here and there that I make sure to touch on those points, but for the most part, it's just me. Like I do a little bit of research on the guest, but for the most part, I like to get to know the guests on the show and just start learning about them on the show, because it keeps the conversation very neutral and it keeps it very conversational. If it's very scripted with questions, it doesn't sound, it's like, oh, this is very scripted and somebody pre-planned this, and it's just not as natural. Like these scientists and these astronauts, they're human. They just get to experience and do really, really cool things.
Exactly. And you hear from the astronauts a lot on TV whenever they're doing, we do a lot of live shows with the astronauts talking to the media from the space station and things like that. But what's interesting, what we started doing recently, is if the astronaut has a spouse, we'll bring their spouse onto the podcast. And that's somebody that would never be talking, that you wouldn't hear of. And a lot of the scientists that have these experiments, a lot of them don't ever get on camera and talk in front of anybody. So to get them sitting behind a microphone and actually hearing the person who created this science experiment or who's working on this piece of hardware that's going on the space station, and you get to really hear the passion behind it, and you get to kind of have that human connection with someone that you wouldn't even think. A lot of times people look at scientists and engineers as if they're like robots and they're not real people, but you get to hear the passion out of them. And at the same time, you're learning something new. You're actually learning what's going on the space station. I joke around. It's like you get to learn where your tax dollars are going. And so it's nice to have that and get that raw emotion from someone who doesn't normally always talk, or an astronaut, something that's not as polished as live TV.
And, with these people, it's with a space station, for example, or a rocket ship, you just see it being launched. You don't get to see it being built.
Exactly.
So they show up to these launches and they just like, oh, it's a rocket ship and it just appeared here. Well, no, that took many, many years of planning and people building and working and meetings and late nights and all this stuff. And it was a whole team of people. So to actually have a person who's clearly highly intelligent to have worked on a project like that, to send us something into space and all these different physical things and physics and numbers and calculations, that's way over my head and comfort zone, to be honest. Like, to hear them talk and hear them totally geek out over something they're so passionate about is just got to be so cool,
Yeah, it is really nice. And it's especially nice seeing, a lot of scientists and engineers are known for being kind of reserved and quiet and don't really talk. They like to be behind the scenes, right? But when you get them behind a microphone and there's no cameras there and they're talking on our podcast, you get to see them kind of, undo their tie a little bit and lean back and just talk about the things that they love. And you kind of see them being all shy at the beginning and they just kind of open up and you sit down and have a real conversation. And I think that's the beauty in it that I get to see from the point of view of recording them. It's like, oh man, you were so shy and quiet before you came in here and we've been talking for like an hour now.
What are some things that you do to kind of break these people open? Like, how do you crack their shells, or how does the guest kind of crack their shells?
Yeah, the Gary, the host, is really good at, before we start actually getting into the podcast, he kind of gives them an overview of things that you want to talk about, because unlike other guest scientists, they like to know what they're going to talk about before they talk about it. They don't really like too many surprises, right? And so we kind of tell them like, hey, we're going to hit these points here. This is what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about it this way. We're going to keep it really conversational. And so if we start leaning and going off onto another topic, that's perfectly fine. Let's just keep going, and just things like that. And so once you get talking to them and cracking jokes, or, finding somewhere that you guys can relate on something, like one of the guests, we found out that Gary's grandfather had worked with him back in like the 40s and 50s, and they kind of connected on that level. And so that guy was super nervous, but by the time I actually hit record on the podcast, he was fully calm and excited to be on here, because he's talking to someone who knew his dad. And it was just really nice to make those connections, like, hey, I like that shirt, and just something that can get them to like, cameras are not here, it's okay, type of thing.
Mm-hmm. He was ready for launch, I guess you could say, at that point.
Yes.
So how did you kind of come up with the name Houston We Have a Podcast? I think that's so genius. I think that's so cool. So how did you come up with that name? And tell everybody a little bit about the show. Like, what is the point of the show? What does the show do? And things like that.
I would love to take credit for being the one who came up with that name, but I did not come up with the name. I believe it was one of our other person in the public affairs office that kind of came up with that name, because we were thinking of different names. We wanted to do the NASA podcast, but it kind of got shut down because like, hey, we're just Johnson Space Center, just one of the many NASA centers. You can't take the NASA podcast. And so they're like, you should do something that's based off of Johnson Space Center. So I know Gary and some of his coworkers were talking about it, and Houston We Have a Podcast came and he brought it up. And the moment he said that name to me, I was like, that's it. I don't want to hear any other names. I love that name. And I feel like it fit us perfect, It's like, that's when you think of NASA, if you tell someone you worked at NASA, the first thing they say is, Houston, we had a problem. Like, oh, here we go. And so, it's kind of like an inside joke for people who work there at NASA, of always hearing that quote. And so I was like, what a great way to take something that normally annoys us and use it as a way to showcase this other side of NASA that you don't normally see. And that's really what the podcast is about. It's just talking about the things of NASA that you wouldn't necessarily see on TV, and just getting the human form of it. See, Johnson Space Center it's the Human Flight Center, right? So that's where all the astronauts train, and they train there, they get their education there while they're still candidates when they first get selected. So they become actual true astronauts, because before they are a true astronaut, they have a 2-year training that they have to do where they're still a candidate. And then once they graduate from that, then they're an astronaut that's ready for missions. but they're always constantly training, and they do that in Houston. So all the astronauts live in Houston. A lot of the scientists and people who work for the things for the ISS live in Houston. The mission control is in Houston. So it's the human part of it is here. And so we wanted to make sure that if we did a podcast, we want to showcase the humans. Yeah, we can talk about how amazing this rocket is, but the people at Johnson Space Center aren't the ones who are, building the rockets. That's another center. We're the ones who house the astronauts and the scientists and the humans in human spaceflight. So we wanted to get that human touch of things. People, like I said, people always look at astronauts like they're, this mythical creature almost, like as if they're not humans. I know I was one of the ones who would do that all the time. I would be so awestruck if I'm walking to one of the cafeterias at Johnson Space Center and I see an astronaut walk by and I'm just stopping and staring. But after a while, it kind of gets normal. Like, hey, they're humans just like me. They have to eat food too. And so it's just one way to get them in touch with the audience and let people understand, like, hey, this is what we're doing here at NASA. Another thing is to stop the myth that NASA closed after the space shuttle, was done. A lot of people didn't know that we were still sending astronauts up there since we weren't launching from Kennedy anymore. So having the podcast is letting people know, like, hey, NASA is still around. And so it's really that human aspect, like you want to get to know this person, not just what they're doing, but get to know their family, what school do they go to, what are their hobbies, just things like that.
That's kind of cool. It's one of those professions that I think, like you had talked about, like you just kind of stop and stare, like when you're a kid, and even like when you had first started, you just like, whoa, like they're a superhuman, It's kind of like when you're a kid and you see like your teacher out at the grocery store or out at the bookstore or wherever, you see a doctor or whomever. It's like, whoa, they actually exist outside of work. That's so crazy. It's kind of one of those like whoa moments. And I'm sure that there's a bunch of like conspiracy theories. Do you guys ever like talk about those and like how crazy some of them are, or trying to debunk some of them, or has that been like a content idea?
Yeah, we've brought up. I can't remember exactly which episode it is. I want to say it was the very first episode when they were talking about the International Space Station and just, NASA as a whole. They were saying, bringing up the fact that a lot of people think that NASA invented Tang. We didn't. It was just so happened that's one of the drinks that they were able to use in space during the Apollo times, right? And so we kind of, talk about those things. And instead of focusing on, the other rumors and things people saying about, space landing is fake, or, they're not really doing this, we focus on the things that we can actually get people to understand everyday life. Like, hey, we helped create the X-ray. We helped with GPS, things that people use at home to where they can get to understand, like, hey, reusable water, that's ISS right there. And they always say, they're drinking yesterday's coffee type of thing. And so we try to focus on the positives of what we're doing instead of feeding into the trolls. You don't feed the trolls. The last thing we need is to try to do an entire episode about debunking a lot of those other myths and, NASA is fake type of things. And it's never going to end well, because those people, they're going to believe what they want to believe anyway. And so there's nothing you can do about it. So might as well focus on the things that it's helping people, like recyclable water and X-rays and GPS and how they're doing research on a space station for cancer and things like that.
Mm-hmm. And how we wouldn't be having this conversation over Skype right now if it weren't for, NASA's forward movements in technology.
Exactly. Yeah.
And we would be able to call our parents on FaceTime or on Google Hangouts or on Messenger on Facebook, or we wouldn't be able to stay connected with the world if it wasn't for NASA's advancements. And I'm sure there's so many different things that are, inside jokes at NASA and things like that.
Oh, yeah.
People are talking about like the moon landing never happened, or like the Earth is flat. That's my favorite one. Like, the Earth is flat. Like, FYI, it's not flat. It's just like these crazy things that these people come up with, and those are the people that are so far out there that they're just going to believe like that what they want to believe. So I like how you're not feeding into that, and you're focusing on the things that NASA and all the space stations are doing to help humanity and
Yeah.
further technology advancement. So I think that's a really cool take on the whole podcast.
Yeah, that's we just want to make sure like we keep it positive, because I want people, and the host does too, after they listen to the podcast, one, they feel like they've learned something, and two, they feel they're in a good mood about what's going on. Like, hey, you know what? The world is not so bad. We have astronauts, all different races and genders from different parts of the world that are working together. The world isn't so bad. You know what I mean? When you think about it that way, I mean, it's an international space station, so we have people from all over the world. We're working with the Russians every single day, and we keep the politics and things out of it because it's bigger than just country versus country type of politics. You're trying to do something for the world, for mankind, not just a certain country. You know what I mean?
And that's truly the beauty of everything. Like when all these people can come together and really show what everybody's worth and like work together as a team to accomplish something so much greater than politics and an election and things like that. Like you are actually working on bigger things like the International Space Station. Like that's such a huge project, and it's doing so much good for humanity. We've learned so much from it. And so it's so cool to hear that. And, the podcast, I'm sure, to enlighten those people and make them feel happy that their tax dollars are going to something good and not something so negative.
Exactly. It's just, just want to keep it positive. And we always try to, incorporate what's going on around NASA. Like if there's a date that's an important date that's coming up, like right now we're gearing towards the 50th anniversary of the Apollo moon landing. Well, just so happened that the 50th anniversary is going to land on our 100th episode of our podcast. And so we're going to have a huge show about that. And so it's so cool how it just so happened, even with, the government shut down, we couldn't release episodes. We had Hurricane Harvey, we couldn't release episodes. But still, our 100th episode ended up on such a huge milestone for NASA. So it's just things like that. It's like, we're on the right track here.
Yeah. And it's those little things like that it's like, wow, I am doing the right thing,
Yeah.
It's just little things like that, how the timing, everything happens for a reason, and it just happens to, be the 50th anniversary and the 100th episode. That's so cool. It just happens for a reason.
Exactly.
So transitioning a little bit, you had put in your Google form, you want to talk about how, you had kind of a struggle, graduating and then after and then prior to working at NASA. Would you mind sharing a little bit of that story to kind of help motivate those to keep going and, you can get to where you want to be even with life setbacks?
Yeah. So for me, I had a bit of a struggle because 6 months before I was supposed to graduate, I got put on academic probation. And so I could make below an 85, and I had to have perfect attendance the entire time. And so it was one of those things where I had to really start to focus. And at the same time, my situation with my housing was getting in trouble. So I was having to sleep on a friend's couch, and just all the struggles of life was hitting me all at one exact time. And so the way I did it was I worked on me. I didn't try to put the blame on my teachers that I had, and didn't try to put the blame on my friends. I just worked on me. I isolated myself away from everyone that was negative and only surrounded myself around positive people that were in the same class as me. And then as my grades started to grow and get better and better, I was able to then, kind of reach out to some of the older friends that I had. And if they were still being negative, then I wouldn't go back and be their friend anymore. I would only bring back positive people in my life, because I think it's more of a mental thing. I had gotten this fear because I was on active probation of failing, and I took that with me even after I graduated. And so I was afraid to fail at something at work. I was afraid to fail at something at my job. And it was one of those things. It was like, well, I kind of gave myself PTSD about failing, to the point where I felt like I couldn't make any mistakes. And that's unreasonable to think. We're all human. We're going to make mistakes. So the main thing I did after graduating and trying to get myself focused and get myself out of beating my own personal self up whenever I made a mistake is just think that, hey, the reason why you got yourself in academic probation when you were a student is because you didn't try. It wasn't because you didn't know what you were doing. It's because you didn't try. You didn't give it 100%. So if you're giving 100% at work, then you'll be okay. You're not going to get fired every single day, because that's what I thought. My first week working at NASA, every time I made a mistake, I'm like, oh man, this is going to be the thing. They're going to fire me. I'm going to lose my dream job. And it wasn't that, because, they understand. It was my first week there. This is a huge change of culture for me. They get it. I'm the new person. They gave me that room to grow, but I wasn't giving myself that room to grow because I was still traumatized for being on academic probation. But I was the one who put myself on there by not trying. So I was like, I can't fail if I try. And I was like, I got a pretty good chance of making it pretty far here at NASA if I just try. And that's what I go into work every day. It's like, hey, I'm going to give it 100%. I don't care how tired I am. Give 100%. If things don't go my way, if I have a bad show, oh, well, that's okay. Just don't make that same mistake the next show. And that's the tips that I give myself is, hey, you can make 1,000 mistakes as long as you don't make the same 1,000 mistakes. And that's the mental process I have to think of. I go into every show with this positive thinking, like, hey, I'm gonna rock this show. This show's gonna be great. I go over my setup multiple times, and I keep that positive thinking. And if anything does go wrong, because of the fact that I've looked over my setup and I know what I'm supposed to be doing, and I've paid attention during my training, it just kicks in like second nature because I tried. So I'm actually preventing myself from failing because of the fact that I tried. And I think that's a lot of the times, people fail when they're going to do something because they're not trying. You got to actually try. You can't just say that you're trying. You got to do it. Try is, it's a verb. You got to put some action behind it.
Mm-hmm. I love that because I love your mindset because it's similar to mine and it's similar to a lot of successful alumni as well. And some of the most successful people out there, however you gauge success, they have tried, they have failed numerous times, but they pick themselves up, they learn from their mistakes, and they continue to move forward. And I like to say you fail forward because if you're failing backwards, you're not learning anything. It's okay to fail because you're going to learn from that. Like even just from doing this podcast, there's every episode I learn something new. Like, oh, I didn't like the way I said that, or I didn't like the way I edited that, or I didn't like the way I EQ'd that, or there's just everything. I won't do it again. It's just different kinds of things that happen. And earlier in your story, when you had first started telling us what had happened, you talked about, you kind of cut all the negative people out. You surrounded yourself with people who are going to be positive and kind of push you forward. And it sounded like it was all about perspective because you didn't blame anybody else for your problems. You blamed yourself. You're like, my teachers aren't going to be able to fix this. My academic advisor's not going to be able to fix this. Nobody's going to be able to fix this but myself. So you kind of changed your attitude and you went for it. And now look what you're doing. You've landed in the captain's shoes. You've landed in the captain's seat to kind of your career. So that's, can you talk about how changing your perspective, and I've talked about this on the show before, but I think it's such an important topic that when people change their perspective and they get out of that negative situation and they start turning things into positive scenarios, like I have this, I have to do this, I'm going to give it my all. And when you do, you start seeing results. So can you talk about how when you changed your perspective, how you kind of started moving forward and your whole career changed?
Yes. For me, it was one of those things where, I was still very young when I was in college. I came straight out of high school. And so I had a lot of growing up and maturing that I had to do. I was getting older in age, but mentally I needed to mature more. And part of that maturity was owning up to my own mistakes. It was you saying, hey, okay, Alex, this is on you. You came to this school. You didn't know any of these people before you came here. That's on you for hanging around the negative people. That's on you for allowing their negativity to be a presence on you and to the fact that you're thinking this. I was hanging around a lot of people who had already dropped out. And so when you're hanging around people who dropped out and you're not mature enough to be able to separate their negativity from your positivity, you're going to bring in that negativity on you and you're going to be like, oh, I don't really care about going to class today. And it's like, for what? You didn't even have that thought process until you got around them. And so when I cut everyone off, I literally cut everyone off and I focus on me and I focus on the people who were in my class. It was one of those things like if you weren't in my class that I had that month and you weren't one of the students that were doing well in that class, you weren't going to hear from me or talk to me because I needed to shut you guys out until I was more mature enough to be able to hang around people that way and not let it influence my own thinking. And a lot of that was growing up and maturing into an adult, And so when I had that mentality, it was like, okay, I can now be around these people, but I can't be around them for too long. I don't like their negative energy. I can say hello and that's about it, but I don't need to spend my time with them. I should spend my time with the students who are making 100s because that's what I want to make. And I should see what are their study habits. I started studying the students and I started studying my instructors to figure out, okay, so how are they doing this? Oh, okay, so she's going to the library right now. Maybe I should go spend some time in the library because what I was doing before wasn't working. And so I learned I may not be the best at it, but I would be the best at trying to get there. I may not be the best audio engineer or the best live engineer, but I'm the hardest working one because I know that I'm not the best. So I'm going to try and learn from who I view as the best. And that's what I did. I just surrounded myself around people who were really good and they challenged me to be better because you don't want to be, the one friend in the group that's not doing anything with your life, right? So you're going to be challenged to do something better. And you got to be around positive people in order to do that because when you're around a bunch of negative people who aren't doing anything, then they're not challenging you to be a better person. And because I was constantly being challenged around all these positive people, my entire mindset changed on life. I was like, hey, I've been looking at life all wrong. People aren't out here to get me. There are really nice people out here in this world. If I just got to go find them, you got to move out of your comfort zone a little bit, and go find the people who are positive. Go find the people who are doing really, really well and see what they're doing. See the type of people they hang around and then make those adjustments in your life. And I think it's one of those things, me being a very analytical person and also being a learner, wanting to always loving learning new things, learning people was probably like the best thing for me. It's because I can understand when this person is, kind of full of it or when this person means well. And this person is really positive or this person is never positive. I probably shouldn't be around them. I don't necessarily like them. So why am I spending my time with them? So I was like, I'm going to not dedicate any time to people who aren't going to push me and people who are negative. I'm going to dedicate my time to people who are actually pushing me, who are really trying. They may not be doing amazing, but they're trying and they're doing something. It's always that thing is be around the people who are doing something. Because doing nothing is going to lead you nowhere. And so I'm always constantly moving forward. And I have that inside of me now branded in my brain that, hey, if I want to be positive, if I want a positive outcome, I got to have a positive income. So I got to think positive thoughts in order to get positive to come out. That's the only way it works. It's not magic. There's no other way around it. There's no shortcuts other than being positive will get you positive things. If you want to be successful, be around successful people. You can't be successful around people who aren't successful. So go find those people that are successful and pick their brain a little bit and see what they're doing in life. And I think that was the biggest thing for me. And that's what switched my mindset. It's like, hey, it's not so much what they're doing or where they're doing it at. It's how they're doing it. It's, okay, I'm not going to stay up to 2 o'clock in the morning watching Netflix. I'm probably going to get a good night's sleep. Or instead of staying up 2 o'clock in the morning doing Netflix, I'm going to stay up to 2 o'clock in the morning studying. It's those little small switches that people don't think about at first. They think they're like, oh, if I want to be, this amazing, audio engineer, I got to work at this particular studio. But they're not looking at what you got to do to get to that studio. And I think that that's really important, is understanding how people got to where they were and not exactly where they are now.
I wholeheartedly agree. And there's so much that you had said that was so, like every sentence you had talked about was so true. And I think a lot of people need that type of motivation, because if you're surrounding yourself with those negative people who aren't pushing you and challenging you, you're never going to hit that launch button. That launch button and that rocket is never going to take off. And, you might have some people that are pushing you forward, and then the other people are going to be pulling you back. So the rocket may not make it out of the atmosphere. So it's just, you got to continue to push yourself and surround yourself with a team and family and friends and colleagues and acquaintances that are going to continue to push yourself forward, like you had said. And it's so, so important, especially if you want to succeed. You're not always going to succeed at everything you do. Exactly. You're going to fail. And I'm sure you've failed many times in your career. And like you said at NASA, you're so worried about failing and you're going to get fired and all this stuff. But they never fired you. So you kind of got that fear gotten rid of because of that. You built your confidence. You continued trying and working and studying really hard and continuing to surround yourself with people who are going to continue to educate you and push yourself. So how was that kind of paid off? Other than you're working your dream job, but there's other little things, even in your personal life, that have these things have helped you.
Mainly a lot of those things have helped me with my confidence. Like I was saying earlier, is that when I got put on academic probation, that was my first time ever failing at anything in life, really. Even in high school, I'd never failed a class ever. So when I had failed so many classes in college to the point where I got put on academic probation, it traumatized me, from not being a failure to failing at almost every single class. And it was one of those things where I was missing the picture of that I was failing because I wasn't trying. And I took it as I was failing because I wasn't good enough. And so when I got to NASA and, I might make a mistake or something, but I kept trying and I kept picking the brain of my coworkers who have been there for 10 or 15 years. Of course, for them, it's going to be a breeze because they've been doing it for so long. And I had to give myself that opportunity. So I would pick their brains on different things. And I'll talk to my supervisor and I'm like, hey, you set this up so quick. How did you do it? And he told me, he's like, oh, I do it because I took pictures of it of my phone. And so now when I come and do my setup, it's really easy to do it. So now I added that to my setup. I take pictures, of a setup that maybe I'm doing for the first time. And so that way, if I have to do that setup again at like 3:00 in the morning, I don't have to try to force my brain to remember how to set this up. I can just go back and look at the pictures. I took it when my brain was functioning and I was awake. And it's just things like small things like that that's rewarding. And having, really successful people and people who are really good at what they do, like my coworkers, if you show them that you actually care and that you really want to learn how to do it, they're willing to teach you. And a lot of people are afraid that people aren't going to teach them. I don't think I ever had a coworker tell me no, they weren't going to teach me how to do something. And it could be something like really, off the wall. Like we have one of my coworkers, he's an editor, but he's also an animator. And so he does a lot of our animations and things like that. And I just asked him one day, I'm like, hey, how do you, how can you draw this cartoon like this? And so out of the blue, he's like, well, here, pull up a seat. And he just showed me. Because I showed interest and I showed that I actually cared, I got to learn something new. And I think it's one of those things. And that's what helped build my confidence over time to begin to walk up to people's. Because I'm surrounded by such amazing and talented people who are really positive, that positivity is now flowing onto me to where I feel comfortable enough to ask them for help. If you're around a bunch of negative people, you're not going to feel comfortable asking them for help because the answer is going to be no. But if you're around positive people and people are really good at what they do and they're spewing positivity, if you ask them for help, they'll be more than happy to show you what you're doing, especially if you're showing an interest in something that is not exactly what you do. And so just those little small things and building my confidence up to be able to talk to people about what I do, working on the podcast was kind of like an eye-opener for me. Being normally quiet to where I'm having to talk with the guests and while I'm miking them up, make small talk. Or if I'm miking up an astronaut, I'm having to talk to this astronaut about how this recording process is going to go. If they're really nervous, I can't be really nervous. So I have to calm them down before they start talking. And it's because of the environment that I'm around where it's okay to ask for help, and that's what gives me the confidence to keep going. And so the main thing that, what I've learned over time and the main thing to how it's helped me, and not just, it seems small, but it's huge. It's just my confidence. I now actually like, hey, I am okay with calling myself an audio engineer. I don't have that imposter syndrome anymore. It's not as bad. I mean, every once in a while I'm like, oh, what am I doing here? And then I'll go and do a show and I'm like, this is why I'm here. I'm actually okay. I'm okay at this. And that's, I can think positive about myself because I'm around positive people.
And not only that, like you're in such a place where you have so many talented people. And if you have that open-mindedness and you're willing to learn anything, you should be a kid in a candy store. You have so much talent, and all these people are willing to teach you and like tell you to pull up a chair and let you teach you animation. Like that has nothing to do with audio, but that is so cool. Why wouldn't somebody take advantage of that? Something like that.
Exactly. I mean, those moments, they happen so often at work. So it's like, I I was supposed to be working on a show yesterday doing audio, and they realized that they didn't really need audio, but they needed a producer to like punch the show out. I'm not a producer, but one of the producers just came up and told and kind of walked me through it. And it's like, Alex, you got this. You know you got it. You're a fast learner. You can go ahead and do it. So I kind of produced my first little mini show, and I was like, this is crazy. I never in a million years would have thought I'd be doing something like this, but they had the confidence in me because what I've shown to them about how, I like learning new things, so where they trusted me to do something new. That wasn't what I'm there to do. It's not what I've been trained to do, but because they trusted me and they had confidence in me, and because I actually showed positivity and showed interest in different things, they felt comfortable with letting me do something out of my element.
Just gonna say, like, your hard work and your tenacity and your feel of failure and then learning from those failures has put you in different shoes. Like, you were able to produce your own little mini TV show. Like, those opportunities, like, who would have thought that would have came through? But you were in the right place at the right time, and the right person had to happen to have known you and know your work ethic. So they're like, you got it, Alex. Like, you can take this. Like, if they didn't trust you and know that you could do it really well, they wouldn't have volunteered you to do it.
Exactly.
So you've proven to them. So that is so important. Like, even though your hard work may not be noticed and somebody might not can't come up and pat you on the back after every show and tell you did a good job today, it's little things like that lead up to it and be like, yeah, my hard work hasn't gone unnoticed. Like, people are paying attention to me.
Exactly. It's those small things, especially with how stressful it is working at NASA. I mean, there's lives at risk in the job that I do, even though I do a small part of it. But, I'm heavily involved in the missions that are going on. And so that stressfulness of working a live show is stressful in any element, and in adding people's lives being involved in it at the same time, and science and so much money is being backed into this. So you feel a failure and that stress of doing something live and having to be perfect. But it's the small things of just, hey, that was a great show you had there. As you're walking past one of your coworkers who's been there for 20 plus years, it's like, whoa, did you just say I had a great show? Thanks. Like, it's something like that'll boost my confidence. Like, I'll be thinking about that all week. I'm like, you know what? I'm not terrible because I had a great show that one day, which means that I could possibly have more days like that. There's a chance. Like, now my chance of went higher, that I'm actually a lot better than I thought I was.
Absolutely. So that, like I said, and like you said, those small moments and that hard work that you put into all these shows and these little things that you go above and beyond for, they don't go unnoticed. People do notice them. It's just that they're not verbally or physically like recognizing you with a hand clap or a pat on the back, or, physically verbally telling you did a good job. It's just everything. People are watching and these things add up. You do mainly audio at NASA.
Yes.
But you've told the story of how do you animate this character? So you're willing to go above and beyond. And for somebody that may want to get into audio engineering, or anybody that wants to get into like animation, like, how important is it for somebody like you to keep an open mind and learn how to do animation, or just sit in and watch somebody do their job to kind of fill their egos a little bit? How important is it to lead to other opportunities, and why is that important to not have tunnel vision in any field?
I think because you don't know what your next big thing is in life. We can all kind of have an idea, and we can all have like this plan, like what I had when I first graduated. It's like, oh, I'm going to go work at this music studio. And I got there and I realized I didn't like it. And so luckily for me, I was open-minded and willing to try different things. So you have to be willing to try, because you never know what you're going to fall in love with. So I was willing to try doing different things. So I started doing AV work before I got hired on at NASA, and I was working at different hotels. And that's where I really learned, soldering cables and hooking up projectors. And I was actually, one of the cool things that I got to put on my resume when talking, about when at my interview with NASA, and tell them like, hey, I also know how to solder cables. I know how to hook up projectors. I kind of know how to hook up lights a little bit because I've done that too. And so they're now looking at me like, oh, you're not just an audio engineer. You're an all-around person that we can have on a team. And that's how you become an asset. And, just by learning those little things, like, learning the projector. So, and if our cameraman is really busy, I can go hook up the projector for him. That's not my thing. That's mainly his thing. But if he's busy and needs help, I can go do it. And that helps us. That makes us look better. We get through the show better. And I'm pretty sure he remembers something like that. Like, you know what? Alex is an okay person. At least she thought of, hey, I'm having a hard time hooking this up because I have a huge setup and it's just me. And she came over to help me. And for me, it's one of those things like, I'm glad I took that time and explored learning how to hook up projectors because it came in handy and I looked really good at work. And so it's just like, you never know what you're learning, how it may come in handy later. So hooking up projectors and learning how to solder cables came in handy because it made me look really good at work. Like, oh, the microphone cable isn't working. I'll just make another one. And they just kind of look and they're like, you know how to make mic cables? I'm like, yeah, I learned how to do that too. It's like, wow, Alex, you kind of know everything. And now I have a ton of, broken mic cables on my desk, but it's one of those things that makes me an asset on the team.
Yeah, and it's just one of those, small things that you kind of take in and you'll be like, you know what? I really do like doing this. It's just one of those things that you're just super thankful for because it's something you never would have ever thought would have come in handy.
Exactly.
But you can see it kind of paying off and just even helping somebody out and just that small gesture. It may not mean a lot to you, but it means a lot to them, like helping them out because their boss is breathing down their neck and you're kind of coming in and making it even smoother for them so they look really good. I'm sure means a lot to them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of a good place to kind of wrap things up as helping others and making sure that everybody else looks good and making sure that you're kind of taking initiative and helping others where they need to and just kind of keeping an open mind with where your next step may be because you never know where it's going to be. So how can the listeners follow you and keep up with you and even follow the podcast?
So for me, I'm heavily active on LinkedIn. So if you just look up my name, Alexandria Perryman, I'm always posting things on LinkedIn. For the podcast, you can look on NASA Johnson Facebook page. We post all the episode promos there. And then also on nasa.gov, you can listen to the full playlist of not just our podcast, Houston We Have a Podcast, but the other NASA podcasts that have branched out now. And so you can look there and you can actually submit us, ideas for the podcast. And what do you want to talk? Who do you want to hear from? What do you want us to answer? Is there a question you have? Things like that. You can do that by going on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram with the hashtag AskNASA. We're always looking for that. Just make sure you let us know it's for Houston We Have Podcast, and we'll be able to answer your question or take your suggestion in. And you never know, we might make a whole episode out of it. We've done that in the past where we've taken a listener's suggestion and made an entire episode about it.
Cool. And I'll put your LinkedIn in the link in the show notes, as well as the Houston We Have a Podcast and then the other NASA websites, so the listeners can navigate to them and then browse around a little bit and follow and subscribe to anything they may be interested in or even suggest the show like you had said. So I want to thank you so much for your time, Alexandra. I really appreciate it. It was such a good conversation. I'll never probably ask that question again of how cool is it to mix rocket launches like that. I'll never have to ask that again. So thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure speaking with a fellow alumni as well. And it's always excellent to see them succeeding out in their industries and doing what they love. I think it's so inspiring to me and so many other people. So thank you for your time tonight.
Oh, great. Thank you very much for having me on here. I'm usually the one pressing record on the podcast, so this is kind of nice being in front of the mic. So thank you so much for having me here.
You're welcome. It's just like, the camera guy be on the other side of the camera. It's a completely different world, but it's kind of nice to see everything kind of come together. But thanks again for your time, and we will definitely be in touch, and have a great rest of the night.
You too.
This podcast has been a passion project of mine for the last 6 to 8 months. And every single episode and every week and every conversation I have with people on the show, I am continually humbled and thankful and inspired and motivated by what they do in their industry for people and for themselves. This week's episode with Miss Alexandria is certainly no exception. Having been through such a rough past and patch prior to her graduation in college and being put on academic probation and then being surrounded by people who weren't motivating her, was really inspiring. And now look at where she's at. She is mixing audio for rockets at NASA. Like that, who does that except for Miss Alexandria? And I'm humbled by our conversation today. And I'm humbled by what she does for herself, for NASA, for society, and for other people. Now, Alexandria is a fellow Full Sail alumni, and she comes back to speak to students and the faculty and the staff to continue to inspire them and educate them as to what she's doing in her respective industry. And I'm so thankful that I had Alexandria on this show because I learned so much from her, how she started the Houston We Have a Podcast and what she does for the show, as well as her work at NASA, whether it be mixing rocket ships, which I still think is so cool, and then working so closely with astronauts and these people that so many children and other grown adults and other people who are, just completely fantasized and, fanatics about space just completely look up to. So I'm so thankful that I had this conversation, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Miss Alexandria. I just want to remind you, before I kind of stop talking and getting off my soapbox here, that I encourage you to sign up to my mailing list, as it helps me notify you when new episodes like this are live, and all of these links will be in the show notes below as well. I also encourage you to leave a 5-star rating and a review in Apple Podcasts or whatever platform you decide to listen to your podcast in. There's also a link to Patreon, which helps me work with you guys, and all the money that I make through Patreon will go directly back into the show to make it better for all of you. And lastly, there is a guest request form. So if you or somebody you know would be a good guest for this podcast, please fill it out or send it over to them to have them fill it out, and I will definitely reach out if they are of interest for the show. So thanks again for tuning into this week's episode. I'm so humbled by this week's episode and amazed at what Miss Alexandria does, and I'm going to continue working harder and staying motivated to continue to achieve my dreams and goals, and I hope that you do the same, and I hope that this episode does the same just for you. So thanks again for tuning in, and I will see you next week on When Life Hands You Lemons.